Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we'll be looking at the Battle of Hattin that happened in 1187. So the Battle of Hattin is widely considered to be one of the worst military defeats for the Crusaders during the medieval period. Its significance to shaping the Crusades in the Holy Land is honestly on par with the actual taking of Jerusalem or perhaps later the fall of Constantinople. But what really happened? After all, the battle is seen in the film Kingdom of Heaven directed by Ridley Scott, but what truly happened that day? Well, Guy de Lusignan became king of Jerusalem in 1186, following Baldwin V's death, as he only ruled for a year due to him also having leprosy, along with his older brother, Baldwin IV. Then, as part of Saladin's conquest of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, he laid siege to the city of Tiberias in July 1187. However, this was not a real siege. You see, Saladin was using the siege as a sort of trick to lure the Crusaders away. Now, following this, Guy de Lusignan assembled the largest army Christendom, or essentially the Kingdom of Heaven, not Kingdom of Heaven, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever put to field. It was made up of all able-bodied men who were able to fight, and it was numbered between 18,000 to 20,000 men. This army, however, was smaller than Saladin's army, as his was numbered from 20,000 to 40,000. Now, the reason these numbers are so off is, of course, because the Christian chroniclers would have made it so that the numbers for the Crusaders seemed less, to make it seem less like a terrible defeat, and the Muslim chroniclers would have made the Crusaders seem like having more, and perhaps Saladin's army having less, to make it seem like a better victory for Saladin. And also, generally, recording army sizes at that time was a very difficult job, as it was very much less well recorded than perhaps battles later on. Now, when Saladin began the siege, he used it as essentially bait, like I said. He wanted the Crusaders to leave their defended positions. But it wasn't actually a real defense that he wanted them to leave from. Like in the film, he wanted them to move away from water. Now, water is one of the most important parts of an army's strength, as without water, an army will become, especially in the arid conditions of the Holy Lands, they'll become dehydrated, delirious, and eventually will die. So he wanted them to lure them away from it. So on July 3rd, the Crusaders did move away from it, as Guy de Lusignan, as discussed in previous videos, was not really a well-able commander. He was very much inexperienced. He didn't really know what he was doing. He wanted it pride-wise. He was very much egotistical. So on July 3rd, they did move away from the waters, and they passed the Springs of Turan, which was the last, essentially, friendly part of their land where they could get water from. And they passed it due to the fact that there was not enough water to feed the entire army, and also they were being harassed by Muslim archers, which meant they couldn't really stop. Now, Saladin essentially used Mongol tactics of feigned retreats. He used horse archers and unmounted archers, which was a very smart tactic. Now, knowing that the Crusaders then knew that they would not reach Tiberias by nightfall, so the Crusaders veered to the left to march 6 miles to the springs of Kafir Hattin. However, Saladin, as smart as ever, moved his army to block them, forcing the Crusaders to pitch their tents in the dry desert. Not only this, he also moved his army behind the Crusaders to prevent them from retreating back to the springs of Turan, which was again a very smart move. Now, during the night time, while the Crusaders tried to sleep, the Muslims banged war drums, shouted insults and curses towards them. They then also set fire to the dry grass. Now, of course, it wouldn't cause a massive forest fire, which is what you'd expect they'd be trying to do, but actually create a lot of smoke. Now, again, smoke, of course, dries out the throat and makes it a lot worse for them. They also did this to essentially enact a form of psychological warfare, essentially to make them feel like what was awaiting for them in hell. Now, Saladin's army was very well supplied at this point, as they had a caravan train of using camels with water being brought up from the Sea of Tiberias, which is now known as the Sea of Galilee. And on the morning of July 4th, the Crusaders came under fire from more mounted archers and normal archers. Now, while this happened, the Crusaders were still marching towards Hattin. However, Saladin blocked them with his army again. This resulted in Guy launching 2 cavalry attacks to break the Muslim lines. However, instead of the Muslim infantry forming a shield wall with spears out to meet the cavalry and to essentially hold them off, they simply made massive holes in the lines to allow the cavalry through. They then reformed the lines and made sure there were troops facing behind them to prevent the cavalry going in again. This resulted in most of the cavalry just simply giving up. They were already dehydrated, so they simply headed towards friendly Christian cities that remained. This resulted in the majority of Guy's army actually just running away, which is what resulted in some of the nobles escaping. This made Guy's situation far worse, as essentially the remaining infantry, seeing the cavalry flee and some nobles flee, demoralised them completely. More of them fled. However, this time Saladin did not let them escape so easily. He had most of them run down with his own cavalry, shot with archers, or just simply stabbed with spears and swords. It was not a good time to be a crusader. So at this point, Guy and what's left of his army, majority Templars and Hospitallers, as they were the most dedicated to fighting, make it to the top of the Horns of Hattin and they set up Guy's tent. They place the Shard of the Cross, the believed Shard of the Cross, of course, we can never be certain if it's true, as they had brought what they believed was the true Shard of the Cross with them as essentially a moral booster, but also a just a general thing that they believed would bring them victory. And he ordered that essentially no one was to surrender until the tent fell. And 3 attacks happened from the Muslim forces, and each time they were essentially beaten back by the Templar knights. However, on the third and final attack, the Muslim forces were able to break through and knock down Guy's tent. Now, the end of the battle happened exactly like with what happened in Kingdom of Heaven. Guy and Renaud of Chatillon and the rest of the nobles were brought to Saladin's tent. Now, unlike in the film, Saladin did offer Guy a cup of water. It didn't have rose water in or ice in, but he offered him some water, as it was a sign of him showing mercy in Muslim culture, as giving water to your enemy is a sign of you showing them mercy. However, like in the film, Guy gave that water to Renaud. Now, obviously, Saladin was upset by this, so he had Renaud of Chatillon killed. However, sources do disagree on how Renaud was killed. Some say that Saladin beheaded him himself. Some say that in the excitement of killing Renaud, in an act of revenge for what he did previously to Saladin and defeating him in some battles, and of course raiding, he moved his sword too quickly and sliced off Renaud's arm, where he was then finished off by Muslim soldiers, and some sources say that he was just simply killed by Muslim soldiers straight away. The rest of the nobles and Guy were simply then imprisoned and were later released after paying ransoms. Now, what happened for the rest of the remaining soldiers? Well, the remaining foot soldiers and if cavalry, if there are any left, as again, there are no detailed lists of which soldiers were captured and which were killed, they were all sent to Damascus. And the sheer influx of slaves going towards Damascus resulted in the slave market of Damascus completely crashing. Essentially, their price just dropped. There were so many. However, for the Knights Hospitaller and Knights Templar, it was a different story. You see, Saladin knew that they would essentially be impossible to enslave, as they'd continue to resist, and impossible to convert, as of course the Muslims did try and convert Christian soldiers, and some would have accepted. So instead of that, he had them all simply killed, beheaded, all of them. And it is recorded that Saladin did watch them all with great glee and joy. Another group he had killed were Turcopoles. Now, these were a simple minority in the region, and they are traditionally Muslim. However, Saladin, realizing that they had converted to Christianity when the Muslims were kicked out of the region, he had them executed as well. Now, when we consider this in terms of battles of the medieval age, it doesn't really create a sort of sense of image of what we imagine. When we think of medieval battles, we think of great armies clashing together, archers in the rear, raining hellfire upon the enemies. However, that wasn't really what happened in this battle. It was very much more of a slow and drawn out battle. It took the entire day, after all, instead of what battles would be, which would be perhaps a few hours, at minimum. It wasn't a typical battle. It was very much similar to what the Mongols would use, or perhaps the Mamluks later on, who were a slave caste in Egypt. Saladin made use mostly of the terrain, the dryness of the desert, and the fact that Crusaders had no water, and archers. So there were no real major battles in terms of infantry on infantry. However, it can also be considered an amazing defeat for the Crusaders. I mean, after all, the Crusaders, in theory, could have potentially won the battle if they had simply kept themselves near water. After all, they were mostly made up of very well-trained soldiers. I mean, the Templars and Hospitallers are very good soldiers and amazing knights. European knights were amazing. However, Saladin had the advantage as he played essentially a psychological warfare against the Crusaders. So although there was no major conflict, the battle lasted hours, the Crusaders were denied supplies. It was more of a siege on the infantry forces themselves than a siege on a castle or just an average infantry battle. So overall, this battle did spell doom for the Crusaders. It didn't have to be a big flashy battle, it didn't have to be big and dangerous, it simply had to beat them, and in such a way that would get Saladin victory later. which it did, as only a few weeks later Jerusalem fell in the same year. So 20,000 to 16,000, as of course no one truly knows, were killed or enslaved. I mean, it is essentially massive. I mean, and also we must remember that was the majority of the male population in most of the Crusader states, which of course resulted in there being barely anyone to defend, which we then see with the siege of Jerusalem. Thank you all for watching.